Hindu and Indian Perspectives, and the chair, Richard Schoenhoven, who's professor of philosophy at the West Point. And thank you, Richard, for guiding us during this panel. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'd actually like to start, if I may, personally by thanking Ed Barrett, Art Athens, Marge Bem, and indeed the entire Stockdale Center and the Naval Academy for once again hosting a fabulous conference, and in particular for being gracious enough to allow someone from West Point to chair a panel. I confess I did check the chair for a whoopee cushion before I sat down. And I appreciate the vote of confidence. Ed apparently thinks that even someone from West Point can use a clock. I'm very, very pleased to be part of this panel on Indian and Hindu perspectives. My own expertise in the area is perhaps exhausted by the fact that I happen to speak an Indo-European language. But thankfully, our panelists know a good bit more than that, and it is my sincere pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Valerie Morkevicius. Practicing that all day. Morkevicius, thank you very much, who is an assistant professor of political science at Colgate University, and who was formerly a fellow here at the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership at the United States Naval Academy. Dr. Morkevicius?
Thank you. So will we follow the previous precedent and stand up, or will we sit to talk?
It's entirely up to you. I prefer to sit.
I do too.
Yeah.
So
Great.
we will establish a new precedent, right? Thus making it possible to apply new ethical principles to new situations. Okay. So I have a few caveats before my talk, some of which are drawn helpfully from Henrik's discussion this morning. And I should set the timer and set it back a little bit. Okay, the first is that in this case, I'm engaging in outsider or observer status, right? So I'm looking from outside the tradition inward. Secondly, what's interesting about Hinduism as an ethical tradition vis-a-vis the Indian state is that Hinduism itself is, until recently, rather outside the political conversation, although that's changing in ways I'm sure my colleague will address. And thirdly, a difficult aspect of my presentation is I'm focusing on texts drawn from three genres. So I'll be looking at some legal texts, at Dharma Sastras and the Code of Manu. I'll also be looking at epic texts like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and I'll also be looking at advice to kings like the Niti Satra and also the Kautilya's Arthasastra. What's somewhat ironic about this, however, is that Hinduism as a practice is based more on practice and less on texts. So there's three major caveats that frame what I'm about to say. Speaking of framing, what I'm going to say, the frame I'm going to use, rather than a historical one, or rather than one that tries to put the text in tension with each other based on the genre of the text, is instead to frame it based on a question about the importance of order. And in some ways, this, I think, reflects the concerns that we were hearing in the Chinese tradition in interesting ways. So I'm going to start with the question of what is order and why is it important? And I'm going to move from this conversation of order to think about how a concept of order might affect the way we think about ad bellum issues and also the way in which we might think about in bello issues, before concluding, wrapping it all up by thinking about use post bellum issues, if I manage to speak quickly enough and concisely enough. So, what is order and why is it important? Broadly speaking, I think we could argue that Hinduism conceptualizes order as just relationships between individuals and between polities. The concept of order is central in many ways to Hindu theological conceptions of state and society. The caste system, with its specially articulated rules for members of each caste and their interactions with each other, exemplifies this concern for social order. A well-ordered society thus requires each individual to know his or her place in the system and to carry out the duties that the position requires. On the international level, Kautilya and Kamandaka's vision of the interstate relations as a mandala or a circle of states reflects a similar logic. The king must correctly identify his state's relative position in international society and act accordingly, pursuing policies of expansion, conciliation, or strategic retreat as necessary. In fact, the domestic and international orders of society actually overlap in the responsibility of the Kshatriya, or the princely caste, to uphold order in both worlds. Order is a necessity in this context, not only for justice and for right relationships between states, but also for creating a world in which we might prefer to live, a world in which we can enjoy greater creature comforts, particularly prosperity. So Hitopadesa, for example, advises that a king protects his subjects who make their ruler prosperous. But protection is more important than prosperity. Without it, we lose even what we have. So order forms the basis of the good life. Unless we have an ordered society domestically and internationally, it becomes impossible for us as individuals or as political communities to pursue greater goods. So how exactly do we go about trying to maintain this order? Order requires force in order to prevent the deterioration of order into disorder or chaos. The type of force that these authors that I'm referring to today have in mind is sometimes referred to as punishment or danda. Thus, in the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna reminds Arjuna that these worlds, all of the cosmoses around us, would collapse if I did not perform action. I would create disorder in society, living beings would be destroyed. So one way of thinking about it might be the natural state of things, right? The natural order of the world is to tend towards chaos and disorder. And you can employ force or you can employ punishment in order to keep the world from falling apart. Punishment was thus understood as necessary to uphold both pillars of the classical Hindu concept of the state, both law and property. The law code of Gautama, for example, explains that the word danda itself is derived from the verb damayati, meaning he restrains, and thus the king's duty is to restrain those who do not restrain themselves. Otherwise, all devolves into a state of nature. As the Code of Manu, for example, declares, if the king did not tirelessly inflict punishment on those who would be punished, the stronger would roast the weaker like fish on a spit. The crow would eat the sacrificial cake, the dog would lick the oblation, there'd be no ownership in anyone, and everything would be upside down. The whole world is mastered by punishment. So the image here is one where all of the right relationships of the world are topsy-turvy, where one's sacrifices are no longer sacrificial because wild animals take over them, where the powerful do what they can and the weak suffer as they must, to sort of quote the Melian dialogue and the Athenians for just a moment. But the use of force and punishment, although it can be used to uphold order, can also be risky for both pragmatic and moral terms. First of all, its misuse can lead to the downfall of kings. So its misuse in the international system can lead to external defeat, right? So if one overextends oneself in trying to create international order, you'll be pushed back. It's a balance of power sort of theory. But internally, the misuse of punishment or danda can also lead to rebellion. So a prince who doesn't act out of virtue, who acts for his own self-worth and tries to impose punishment or order domestically, will find himself being overturned by his own population. So this, I think, suggests ways in which we can draw out ad bellum concerns from a general worldview about the importance of order. Admittedly, within Hinduism, there's less emphasis on ad bellum concerns than we might find in Christianity and Islam. For example, the Code of Manu and the Arthasastra simply list different types of war, as opposed to commenting as to which of those might be more desirable than the other. But nonetheless, I think that when we combine a focus of order with a focus on virtue ethics in Hinduism, we're able to derive some principles, namely that just wars are those that advance or defend order. This includes, I think, a concept of self-defense, fairly evidently, and I think we could also make an argument here for humanitarian intervention. So if we turn to the Mahabharata, which is a huge epic, dealing with the story about how the Pandavas try to get back their throne from the Kauravas, it's a secession dispute, right, which has a lot of interesting aspects as to whether the Pandavas are entirely in the right. But nonetheless, the Kauravas in this text are described as criminal, as lawless, and as being oppressing of their population. And this is one of the many justifications for the Pandavas to respond to the Kauravas with military force, despite, in this case, there actually being cousins and kins. Furthermore, we can find that raison d'etat is also a legitimate cause, so long as the purpose is to serve the state and not the prince's private interest. The prince is meant to be a servant of the state, the protector of the state, and not to serve himself. Thus, we can find the Nitisara counseling the king to exert himself for securing prosperity in the shape of territorial aggrandizement, etc. But the idea here, right, is not expansion for one's own good, right, but expands in to create order, perhaps by taking over neighboring kingdoms who are failing to keep up their degree of order domestically, and also to add resources to one's own state to further the ability of creating order domestically. So what exactly would be unjust courses, right? If unjust causes. If raison d'etat is legitimate, where do we draw the line? Unjust causes are causes which are motivated by vices. The Common Docket, for example, cites examples of lust, anger, avarice, fiendish delight in doing injury, morbid desire for honor, and arrogance as vices which must be avoided by the wise and the just ruler. This is a virtue ethics approach to deciding what counts as a just cause and what counts as an unjust cause, right? So a just and virtuous prince will know what are just and virtuous causes and will be able to distinguish between causes that uphold order and causes that don't. I think, interestingly, that this also ties into the responsibility to protect concept in interesting ways. If a king fails to protect his people, he may actually lose his right to rule. In the Mahabharata, there's a discussion of a scenario where a king has unjustly slaughtered his own people. And a Brahmin describing this situation declares, when there's a preventer of crime in the world, right, when there's a just king, no criminal will be found in any world. But if a criminal never meets one who prevents him, then many in the world rise to criminal acts. He who, albeit knowing and capable, does not suppress crime may be a master, but he's tainted by the same act, right? So a critique of someone who's in the position of being a king, but who isn't holding up the responsibilities of kingship properly. If kings and sovereigns, even though able to do so, could not be made to save my fathers, then I am wroth with the world and I am master to them. Right? So the very interesting twist at the end of this passage is that a Brahmin who's not supposed to take over political and military leadership takes that role onto himself because the king has failed to do it properly. This, I think, leads to interesting conversations we could have later about whether this is a precursor to responsibility to protect. You lose your right to sovereignty if you fail to be the king of the right sort. Finally, in terms of jus ad bellum issues, we might think a bit about last resort. There are both principled and pragmatic reasons to uphold it from within the Hindu tradition. The first is war is risky and war is costly. So even though war might be a way of expanding order, it can be dangerous to attempt to do so. The Niti Sara thus recommends that a king would rather do well to willingly submit to certain hardships than launch upon war, for war is ever prolific of evil consequences. The Mahabharata itself suggests that the recourse to war shouldn't come first. The Pandavas wait 13 years in exile, during which period they experience more and more outrages before seeking to avenge themselves. And in the text itself, the seer Vyasa warns, victory is uncertain. It depends on chance. Even they that become victorious have to sustain loss. He repeats this refrain later to say, what is more frivolous than going to war? Why would a man knowingly go to war? Who, cursed by his fate, would choose war? So although war can be used to uphold order, it apparently shouldn't be the first choice. This brings us to something which in the Western tradition is recently becoming a new matter of academic discussion, namely jus ad vim, or action short of war. Within Hinduism, this suggests three possible alternatives to war. First, diplomatic solutions or conciliation. So when there is a tension between two kingdoms, the first thing that a king should do is try to find a way of working it out diplomatically. Second, economic solutions, bribery. Right? Several of the texts, Kautilya brings this up as well. Why not simply bribe the other side to accept a more just relationship with you? And lastly, political solutions. These are quite intriguing because they're not diplomatic or economic at all. It suggests, for example, in the Mahabharata, the idea of sowing dissension amongst the ruling elites on the other side. The same idea can be found in Kautilya's Arthasastra, which is much more of a realist text. In the Mahabharata, for example, Vyasa says, it's said that the success which is won by negotiation and other means is the very best. That which is achieved by producing disunion among the foe is indifferent. While that success, O king, which is won by battle is the worst. In battle are many evils, the initial one, as it is said, being slaughter. So here we have a hierarchy of foreign policy choices, with war being the worst option and conciliation being the best, and then one has a set of policy choices. All of these choices, again, are being meant to achieve a goal of order. So what about in bello rules? Is it possible to bring order onto the battlefield within the Hindu tradition? And it seems quite clear that one can do this. First of all, we have to make a distinction here in the Hindu tradition between what are called open wars and what are called concealed wars. So open wars, or dharma yuddha, are open battles between conventional forces in a declared war on a separate battlefield. And a very special set of chivalric rules apply to that kind of fighting. But there's also discussion, particularly in texts like the Arthasastra, about concealed wars. And these include things like the Kuta Yuddha, which are concealed wars involving an element of surprise, right, involving ambushes, but still, I think, understood to be between conventional forces. And the Tsuni Yuddha, which are concealed wars that use not only non-conventional means, but also non-conventional forces. And here what's had in mind are policies of assassination and poisoning against the other side. Implicitly, these three categories of war are uneven in moral terms. And this comes up in discussions, the ordering of them in the way that they're put in the text, but that is never made explicit. Still, the choice about which to use is seen as a pragmatic choice, which might be troubling unless we remember the claim I'm trying to make, which is that the good king is a virtuous king, and the virtuous king will know which one to choose in terms of the best policy for pursuing order. One way of thinking about this is to remember the very famous scene in the Bhagavad Gita between Krishna and Arjuna. Arjuna is standing on the battlefield. He's contemplating whether he should go to war. He's thinking he really oughtn't because he's fighting his kin, and he doesn't realize his charioteer is actually Lord Krishna in disguise. And Lord Krishna gives him some very good advice and says, your duty as a kshatriya, as a prince, is to fight this war. Right? This is your duty. And you're misunderstanding your duty if you think that there's any other way to go about doing it. So you need to embody your duty and act without concern for the consequences. Because the virtuous consequences will play out, right, implicitly, if you behave in a virtuous way, which you will do because you are a virtuous actor. There are also very specific protections in the Hindu tradition dealing with non-combatants of various sorts. And I want to divide these up into two types, and we'll talk about those two types in just a moment. So types of person, women, children, Brahmin, these religious philosophers, etc., and ambassadors. Also the type of action. So certain individuals who are hors de combat for various reasons don't pose threats and are protected. So the Badayana, for example, lists several types of persons considered immune from attack, including those who are in fear, intoxicated, insane, or out of their minds. You should also not fight with those who have lost their armor, nor with women, infants, and aged men, or brahmanas, excepting assassins, right? So the Brahmins are generally considered to be protected, but if they're being used as an assassin, as a tool of politics, they lose that protection. The Soptika chapter of the Mahabharata provides a similarly lengthy list of individuals, seemingly drawn from a similar list in the Code of Manu, of people who should not be targeted. One should not cast weapons upon kin, Brahmin, kings, women, friends, one's own mother, one's own preceptor, a weak woman, an idiot, a blind man, a sleeping man, a terrified man, one just risen from sleep, an intoxicated person, and one that is heedless. So how can we put all of these categories together? One is clearly types of people who are believed to be non-combatants because they simply aren't the kinds of people who fight, right? So women, children, Brahmin, those who are insane, not capable of fighting in this worldview. But also we have those who are not meant to fight because of the type of action which they're engaging in. So people who are running away, people who are sleeping, people whose hair is disheveled, right? It's actually one of the categories, which is my favorite because I feel very safe as a result. Right, these are all actually referring to soldiers. Soldiers who in that moment aren't capable of being soldiers, right? So if you've lost your armor, if your weapon is broken, if you're running away from the battlefield, hence the bad hair, right, you are in a position where you are not targetable, right? Because you're not posing an objective threat to the other. Just as certain groups are categorically protected, their property is also immune from targeting. The gardens and farms of civilians, along with religious places, are protected. We can find an example of this, for example, in the Agni Purana, which asserts that the fruit and flower gardens, temples, and other places of public worship should be unmolested. all of these rules about those who shouldn't be targeted fall inside of a broader category of rules about fighting fair, about maintaining order on the battlefield by making sure that the parties are evenly and parallelly matched. Some of these rules about fighting fair deal with the question of fighting at night. You shouldn't do it, and that might have additional benefits for civilians and their property. But what I want to focus on for just one remaining minute is that the rules forbidding weapons that could not, by their very nature, be targeted, but particularly the idea that we should match the other with the type of weapons they're using. So most of the rules regarding fighting fair, for example, clearly apply only in the context of chivalric relations between soldiers, and we find in the Mahabharata that the opponents agree that those engaged in contests of words should be fought against with words. A car warrior or chariot warrior should have a chariot warrior for his antagonist. One seated on an elephant should have a similar combatant for his foe. A horse should be met by a horse, and a foot soldier by a foot soldier. Interestingly, combatants should only fight with similar weapons, even if a superior weapon is available. No unfair advantage is to be taken of the opponent's weakness. In the Ramayana, for example, Rama fights his final battle on foot while his enemy remains mounted on his chariot. The gods interrupt in the favor of the man on foot, arguing that it's an unfair match. Furthermore, certain weapons are banned as unfair or unnecessarily cruel, including those which are concealed, barbed, or smeared with poison, or whose points blaze with fire. I promise the post-bello rules. I won't go into detail except to say that after you conquer your neighbor's territory, it's considered wise and possibly morally beneficial to put back into power the son of the king who you deposed, and to try to put back in all of the religious practices and legal practices that had been there before you got there, which is very parallel, I think, to responsibility to protect and the requirement to rebuild afterwards. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking. And I believe we agreed that the panel agreed that we would hold all questions to the end so that you might ask them of both speakers at the same time. So with that out of the way, I would now like to introduce Dr. Sumit Ganguly, who holds the Rabindranath Tagore Chair in Indian Cultures and Civilizations and directs the Center on American and Global Security at Indiana University, Bloomington. He is currently completing the Oxford Short Introduction to Indian Foreign Policy for Oxford University Press. He is working on a book called Deadly Impasse, Indo-Pakistani Relations at the Dawn of the New Century for Cambridge University Press, and also on a book called India Ascendant with William R. Thompson for Columbia University Press, a very busy man. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ganguly.
Thanks very much. Once again, I'd like to reiterate my thanks to Ed Barrett for inviting me, especially at short notice, and I'm delighted to be here, particularly on this glorious day, especially after the winter that we have endured in the Midwest. I speak today neither as a political theorist nor as a military ethicist. Instead, I speak as a scholar of international politics who happens to focus on South Asian militaries. My talk is really focused upon India's use of force in the post-independence era, from 1947 to the present day. And there are 10 propositions that I think can be gleaned from India's use of force over the course of this period of time. At the very outset, since the vast majority of you do not spend the bulk of your waking hours thinking about the use of force in South Asia, I'm going to provide the first proposition simply spells out what has actually transpired in terms of war. There have been, using the Singer and Small standard that international scholars of international politics use, of 1,000 battle deaths, there have been 4 wars on the subcontinent between India and Pakistan. There was also another war between China and India in 1962, and I can deal with that during the Q&A, but the bulk of my remarks really are going to be focused on India's use of force in these 4 conflicts. The 4 conflicts took place in 1947-48, almost immediately after independence, over the disputed territory of Kashmir, which still remains the subject of an international dispute between India and Pakistan. It still remains unresolved. Second was 1965. The third was 1971, and this largely stemmed from the exigencies of Pakistani domestic politics and then the spillover into India, quite literally, with the flight of 9.8 million people into various parts of eastern India when they faced a genocidal regime in East Pakistan. And the term genocide I used advisedly. If you want to question it, I suggest you read a marvelous book by an extraordinary American diplomatic historian, Gary Bass, who's just published probably the definitive work on the subject called The Blood Telegram, which refers to Archer Blood, an extraordinarily courageous American Foreign Service officer who used the term genocide to describe what was taking place in East Pakistan in 1971. And the most recent war, of course, was 1999, once again over the issue of Kashmir. So there have been 4 wars between India and Pakistan since 1947. What is striking about these wars, despite the fact that great stakes were involved, nothing short of the identities of the two countries, that the very limited number of casualties that actually took place as a consequence of these wars. In fact, far more people have died in the insurgency in Kashmir, in the Indian-controlled portion of Kashmir, which erupted largely as a consequence of Indian malfeasances towards the state in 1989. Close to, by my estimate, 90,000 people have perished in that insurgency, making it a particularly sanguinary experience than all 4 Indo-Pakistani wars combined. What explains this? In considerable measure, it stems, particularly in the first 3 wars, from the limited use of firepower, the limited availability of firepower, and the limited use of firepower. And I'll explain in a moment these restraints on the use of firepower that took place, quite apart from the limited availability of firepower. Thirdly, in considerable part, the wars were not particularly brutal or sanguinary because both sides, especially until 1971, relied on set-piece battle tactics largely derived from the experience of Indian and Pakistani officers who often fought in the same units during World War II. So they really were deriving much of their knowledge of battle tactics from battle tactics that had been employed in World War II. And this enabled officers to reach interesting sorts of agreements, which I will talk about in a moment. The only real departure from set-piece battle tactics came in 1971 when India resorted to a kind of a blitzkrieg strategy, largely bypassing major garrisons in East Pakistan and heading directly using mechanized armor to seize the capital city of Dhaka and then carrying out mopping out operations to subdue any last pockets of resistance. Also in the 1971 war, there was a fascinating convergence of Indian strategic imperatives, essentially breaking up Pakistan as a consequence of this war, along with norms of humanitarian intervention. Even though India couched its intervention in East Pakistan purely in humanitarian terms and rhetorically in humanitarian terms, one does not have to be a strategic genius to come to the realization that this was a neat convergence of both strategic imperatives and humanitarian concerns. Obviously, it was important to stop the mass slaughter of the Bengali population in East Pakistan by the Pakistani army, which was mostly a Punjabi and Pashtun-dominated army, and viewed Bengalis with utter contempt, and a contempt that actually can be traced back, ironically, to British colonialism, where there were colonial notions of anthropology which infused military recruitment where certain races in India, if you believe that there's such a thing as a race, most anthropologists today would tell you that's utter and contemptible nonsense, because there is no biological basis to notions of race, but that those mind-forged manacles, to use a phrase from William Blake, still continues to operate, and certainly did in the Pakistani army, where recruitment was based upon these British colonial notions of martial races, and Bengalis, of which I am one, were considered to be non-martial, and thereby inherently incapable of warfare. And these notions powerfully influenced the genocide. And so there was a compelling incentive on the part of Indians to stop the genocide, but at the same time, this was a marvelous opportunity to break up Pakistan. And that's precisely what happened, leading to the creation of Bangladesh. Interestingly enough, given the passions that were engaged in all these wars, particularly the 71 war, there was a scrupulous adherence to Geneva Conventions, and in addition to that, it needs to be underscored that there were 90,000 Pakistani prisoners of war as a consequence of the 71 war. Not one of them were maltreated or subjected to torture. In fact, they were protected from the wrath of the Bengali population who wanted to have war crimes trials and prosecute these men who had been involved in some fairly egregious acts of violence. But they were repatriated as a consequence of a treaty that was agreed upon in 1972, and each and every officer and enlisted man was treated according to rank and not in any way subjected to any form of torture or any form of maltreatment. What is also intriguing about these wars, and this unfortunately will not last in the future, this is a fairly robust prediction that I can make, is that there were a series of intra-war restraints. And in the interests of time, I'll only cite one or two, and then during the Q&A, I can elaborate on them at greater detail. How were these intra-war restraints carried out? They were carried out largely because the principal officers on both sides had trained at British military academies. If they were in the Air Force, they had gone to Woolwich. If they were in the Army, they had gone to Sandhurst. If they were in the Navy, they had gone to Southampton. And as a consequence, it was possible, for example, in the 1965 war, for Air Marshal Asghar Khan of the Pakistani Air Force to call up his counterpart, Air Marshal Arjun Singh, in the Indian Air Force and say, the gentlemen do not bomb each other's cities. And this was a tacit agreement that was reached without any consultation of the political authority, and both sides scrupulously adhered to avoiding city-busting strategies, even though they had the capability to attack cities. This also made enormous sense because you would needlessly and fecklessly impose costs on a hapless population which did not have adequate air defense, because most air defense was focused upon protecting military assets. The only violation of this was when a poor Pakistani pilot found himself cornered by Indian interceptors, and just so that he could quickly enter Pakistani territory, he jettisoned his bombs outside the city. But other than that, this was scrupulously adhered to by both sides. It will not obtain in the future, and this is my prediction, because that generation has either one foot on the funeral pyre or one foot in the grave, depending upon their religious preferences. That generation will not exist anymore, and in fact, the vast majority of them have retired. And the only time Indians and Pakistanis meet is in retirement, when they meet in Bangkok or elsewhere, in various Track 2 fora, or on the battlefield. And so those old school ties that existed and the rapport that was possible will no longer hold in the future. Generational shifts, unfortunately, will come into play. I would be remiss if I didn't say one word or two, and particularly provoke a discussion on this note, that the overt nuclearization of the region after 1998 has led to what scholars of international politics and security studies refer to as the stability and instability paradox, and this was clearly visible in 1999. I have written an entire book on this subject where I argue that the possibilities of full-scale war in South Asia, contrary to what the non-proliferation community in this country believes in and propagates, is essentially over. You're not going to see major war on the subcontinent for the simple reason that nuclear weapons have a marvelous way of producing a certain concentration of mind, regardless of what culture you hail from or where you happen to live geographically. And I think it applies with considerable force to South Asia. How then do I explain the 1999 war? Largely by the stability and instability paradox. The region where Pakistan made these incursions is of no strategic significance. It is a trackless wasteland. I've been there, so I know of what I speak. These are altitudes of 14 to 15,000 feet where human beings cannot fight for extended periods of time, particularly in winter. And so they made an incursion in an area which was of no particular strategic significance, largely as a limited probe to test Indian preparedness and awareness along this particular area. And then, of course, it escalated for reasons that I can talk about at greater length during the Q&A. Final decisions, by the way, to initiate force, at least as far as India is concerned, remains firmly ensconced in civilian authority. The military in India, and this is an interesting case study, that how the two countries diverged, and I've written about this at greater length elsewhere, after independence, where in one country, Pakistan, the military dominates politics completely, even till this day, despite the presence of a civilian authority. In India, it remains utterly subservient, and in my judgment, overly subservient to civilian authority. And so on critical questions of war and peace, and on the decisions to go to war, it's entirely in the hands of civilians and not in the hands of the military. The military can only advise civilian authority on questions of battle tactics and timings, and that's something I can talk about also during the Q&A. Finally, to conclude on a note designed to provoke some attention and perhaps discussion, there is a popular and fundamentally flawed belief and considerable political commentary that India, despite its professions, particularly in the early years of restraints on the use of force, on its interest in the Pacific resolution of disputes, shamelessly used force against the Portuguese in Goa. Nothing could be further than the truth. And we need to correct the historical record because, unfortunately, a colonial palimpsest still informs our thinking on the subject. Contrary to popular belief and commentary, Prime Minister Nehru negotiated in good faith with the dictatorial regime of Salazar in Portugal, and only when negotiations reached an absolute deadlock did Nehru authorize the use of force, and only then, when he came under criticism from African leaders who said, here you are promoting decolonization in Africa, and you cannot induce the Portuguese to leave your own country, where they still have 3 substantial colonial enclaves on the western coast of India. And faced with this kind of embarrassment and faced with an utter deadlock, an impasse with the Salazar regime, Nehru authorized the use of force. So if anything, had I been in his shoes, I would have authorized the use of force a lot earlier, because this colonial appendage had no business staying on long after India had managed to shed the shackles of British colonialism. Let me end on that note. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks to the extreme professionalism and courtesy of our presenters, we have a fair amount of time for questions. So, but please do keep your questions short. We'll start with Dr. Cook.
For Valerie, it's a friendly suggestion. I think you could take your idea of fighting wars to maintain or restore order much farther in the metaphysics of hinduism, right? For example, you could talk about the extreme fear, the yuga cycle for starters, right? We're always in the Kali Yuga, right? So things are at their worst. The fear of mixing of castes, right? The idea of the avatar who has to come during times of chaos to restore order. I mean, all of those themes, I think, the fight against the Rudras, the drought dragons, right? All of those themes, I think, suggest a kind of metaphysics of imminent chaos all around us that would deepen your argument.
I think you're absolutely right. I do not disagree.
Dr. Sykes?
Thank you very much for excellent presentations. Would be interesting to hear the two of you comment on each other in a way, because the question is what informs mainly Indian military ethos today, military education, what books are read, what infuses military academies, and so on. And what we have heard is, of course, that the English colonial tradition has had quite a lot of influence because of the education of many at British military academies. But on the other hand, of course, this is a country, at least from my experience and my reading, where there is a certain consciousness about an old tradition, not least many narratives from Bhagavad Gita. So what, maybe a naive question, but still to both of you, what would be read and what would be important today and in the years ahead in forming Indian military ethics? Thank you.
Do you want me to go first?
Okay. That's a terrific question. I meant to add a sentence at the very outset, but I was so conscious of the time that I thought I'd better focus on my remarks rather than any sort of ancillary matters. It is ironic that with such a rich tradition that Valerie has so carefully outlined for us, that very little of this actually informs Indian military thought or Indian military practice. It is disproportionately influenced by the British colonial tradition and the role of the Indian military, which unfortunately, and this is quite tragic, that military history, the writing of Indian military history in India is absolutely pathetic. There's no other way to describe it. Indians don't know, for example, of their extraordinary contributions in World War I and World War II. At my own university, I am trying to focus attention as we approach the 100th anniversary of World War I of the stellar Indian contributions to the war effort. Because hardly anybody is aware of this. It's a history that has largely been effaced for the most part. I mean, considerable blood and treasure was expended. About the Indian military academies, of course, there's sort of the inevitable teaching of Clausewitz and sort of standard histories of the conduct of war in all the five wars that India has fought, a little bit of World War II history, and to be quite candid, this is a completely outdated syllabus for a major military power. I have some experience of speaking at Indian military academies, and my flesh crawls when I think of the anachronistic syllabi, the kind of lack of attention to the very substantial academic writing that exists in the West, produced primarily by political scientists and many of my colleagues, the almost complete innocence of this. So there is a real disjuncture between a highly professional army and its more intellectual or doctrinal training.
I don't have too much to add to that, just that I think one problem that the Indian military might face would be if they were to try to find something to put on the syllabus to teach about the history of Indian ethics vis-a-vis war, there aren't too many choices out there. So there's a handful of articles. There's a recent monograph by Kaushik Roy, which is definitely worth reading. But from for such a large tradition, there's shockingly little. There was a period, I think in the 1950s and early 1960s, where there were several philosophical and legal conferences organized to talk about these issues in the context of decolonization. So to suggest that India signing on to international agreements, to the Geneva Conventions, et cetera, was actually not signing on to a colonial worldview, but instead reflective of India's own deep history in ethics. But again, right, for 70 years of history, that's not very much scholarship to point to, which may be one reason why it doesn't get
There's
covered.
almost a deafening silence.
If the Indian military is as subordinated to the civilian government as you guys have suggested it is, then the obvious question is, how much is that civilian government influenced by this position that Professor Morkevicius has laid out?
This, I think, is complicated, right? So on the one hand, the same problem applies, right? There's not much to read, so even if one was a politician and had lots of free time, because politicians, I'm sure, have that, to read about ethics, they'd have the same problem. But I think the other problem is, until recently, and I think I'll defer to Professor Ganguly on this, it's been considered inappropriate to bring up explicitly religious arguments to justify policies on the national level. And so it's hard to know what politicians, how politicians might have been influenced in a direct one-to-one way. But that's changing, and so I'll defer to my more contemporary colleague.
I know, I think Valerie is exactly right. Because the first Prime Minister of India was a staunch secularist, his shadow was a very long one, and it's only recently that Hindu nationalism has been coming to the fore, and it's become more acceptable in the public arena to talk about religion and politics. This was really anathema in the first 30 to 40 years of the Indian state. But the current crop of politicians, not to put too fine a point on it, even if they invoke India's great traditions, their intellectual capacities are so limited that their ability to draw on this tradition would require them to go back to school.
Sir.
Yeah, I have a question to Dr. Sumit Ganguly. You discussed the war against Pakistan 3 times so far.
4.
4 times, but you didn't discuss the war against China and in 1963. And in the case of Pakistan, you said no violation of ethics because they graduate from same British military academy. But how about the case of with China? Because they have still some conflict between China and India.
Yes.
Can you elaborate that?
Yeah, I briefly mentioned the Sino-Indian border war of 1962 in passing. It was a very short, brutal, harsh war for which India was completely unprepared. Indian soldiers fought at altitudes of 14,000 feet without thermostatic clothing, without proper acclimatization. More people died of pulmonary edema, with lungs filling up with fluid because they had been transported from the plains to altitudes of 10, 12, 14,000 feet without proper acclimatization. The Indians fought valiantly, but valiant action is not a substitute for having adequate weaponry and adequate clothing. When the spring thaw came, they found Indian soldiers still holding on to machine gun nests where they had literally run out of ammunition. And most of them fought with bolt-action 303 rifles, and having fired one, I know what it's like. It basically dislocates your shoulder if you're not careful. These are Lee Enfield rifles, a World War I vintage. That's what the common Indian soldier fought with. The Chinese declared a unilateral ceasefire and withdrew to more defensible positions. There's still a border dispute. India claims 14,000 square miles of territory, with which in their view the Chinese occupied. The Chinese claim another 90,000 square miles of what India considers to be its own territory. India is in the process currently of raising 2 new strike corps of about 64,000 troops. It's created a new air base up north. There have been a series of what in Indian eyes are Chinese incursions. So it's very much a live border. And the dispute after close to 14 rounds of talks have not yielded any great movement. Let's say the movement has been glacial.
Yes, for Valerie. So an ad bellum ethic that rests on extending order, I agree with you that does seem to have implications for RTP, but it also seems to suggest perhaps an expansionist foreign policy. I mean, how do you extend order, how do you impose order on an unordered international system, other than going out there and imposing it to the farthest extent that your power, your material power allows. And so as India's material power expands, as it certainly has been, should we expect a more expansionist foreign policy based on that ethos?
Based on the ethos, I think that's plausible. Based on India's commitment to international law, I think it's unlikely. Also, it's to sort of push back, right? The idea of expanding order is something that one does, and there is an argument that could be made for creating a single world federation within the text. So underneath a single ruler called the Samrat, who is above the level of ordinary kings. But this world order, it's not an empire, it's a federation. Something like Kant's Perpetual Peace Federation, which might be parallel to the United Nations. So I think there's actually a way in which it would be quite natural if India were following this ethical perspective, which we're both saying was hard to tell and probably unlikely. But even if it was doing so within an international legal framework, it could do so not in a way that would not be in tension with its claims for order.
Well, we've actually heard that the Hindu tradition doesn't have that much practical influence, though, on policy or on the Indian military ethic. And we've also heard that the old post-colonial, post-British military ethic is receding. So I'm sort of wondering, what is the Indian military ethic now, if it's not really Hindu and it's not as much British anymore? I was also wondering, has there been any effort by the senior officers to take the essentials of that gentlemanly code of the British restrained officers and try to pass some of that on, or maybe sort of fuse it with some local elements like John Lynn talks about in his book Battle. He talks about the Indian Army in the 19th century.
The short answer to your last question is no, because that depends upon reciprocity, and you're not going to get reciprocity from Pakistan or China. China, of course, comes from a completely different tradition, wasn't colonized, but with Pakistan, you're not going to get that reciprocity anymore. Because you have no one you can contact. There is now a hotline between the DGMOs, the Director Generals of Military Operations. But that hotline, I'm told, is used less frequently than it should be. There is a weekly conversation that's supposed to take place. I'm not certain that it happens every week. And often that hotline is used more for complaints about each other rather than saying, look, we're about to conduct something along the border, and this is not preparations for an offensive operation, but it's largely because we just need to have a certain level of readiness. I'm not sure that it's used for that very purpose. And in fact, in a couple of crises, we have some evidence it was used more for deception rather than clarification or the conduct of CBMs, of confidence building measures. So No, there isn't. So what are they relying on? Bad readings of Western texts. Very bad derivative readings of Western texts, which they are swallowing in a very crude fashion. Notions of deterrence, notions of compellence, but with a notions of coercive diplomacy, but with a kind of a half-baked understanding thereof. In fact, I've had to tell senior military officers that for God's sake, instead of saying this is what Barry Posen says in the sources of military doctrine, what does Colonel Singh think about this, about the sources of India's military doctrine? Barry Posen was writing about military doctrine in the Intra-war years. That's important to know, but how might that be applied to the Indian context? How does organizational behavior shape Indian military thinking? There is this incapacity to do so, this incapacity to engage in independent military thought. And this is frightening given the size and the complexity of the Indian military.
Actually, if I could push back a little on your implicit question, right, which is, in a context where open political discussion of religious tradition as a motivation isn't looked upon highly, and where the scholarship around it is essentially non-existent, there's a question that emerges, I think, of whether the tradition is at all relevant, right? And I think the answer to that hinges a little bit on our ideas about whether individuals are embedded in cultures, and whether those cultures have influences on how we behave as individuals that are sort of diffuse relationships, right? So we can think about learning cultural beliefs or learning religious beliefs about conflict in an explicit way, but we could also imagine that it would be possible to have access through those in indirect ways. So one example I might point to is the Mahabharata text, the epic. Even if people aren't reading it as a religious text, there's a comic book version, right? It forms the basis for a lot of wonderful Bollywood movies. And in those films, these ideals of chivalry, which I talked about a little bit in the talk, are played out on the screen. So one could have access to the tradition through a variety of indirect ways that might color how you think about things. But whether it actually does or not, you would need better social scientific work to find out.
One more question. One last question? Or perhaps I will show off my timekeeping abilities and end just a bit early then if there are no more questions.
Well, can we thank the panel for a great presentation and Q&A session?